Good afternoon, good morning to everyone.
Morning, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
everyone.
Bonjour. Hola from Mexico.
Good afternoon from Ethiopia. It's afternoon for us here, so it's good afternoon, I said.
Kunjan, you're muted.
I was saying I suspect it's afternoon for a lot of colleagues joining from Africa and evening for those joining from Asia. So we are a few minutes over time. We do have a wonderful session planned today, and I know people are going to be joining in, but maybe what we can do is that, as always, please, use the chat box to introduce yourselves, where you're coming from. It's always nice to know who we are sharing space, thoughts, and ideas with. We do have French interpretation available. Sarah, if you can mention in French how people can access the interpretation, please.
Sure. Bonjour à tout le monde. Nous avons une traduction en français grâce au docteur Paul-Marie. Veuillez trouver le bouton d'interprétation en bas de votre écran.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to our monthly call for April. Greetings for whatever time of the day it is in your part of the world. It has been a very, very active month for us. I'm sure it has been for all of you, and we will talk about that a little later during our call today. Just to quickly take us through the agenda for today's call. So we are going to, as always, start with a very short introduction to what MCLD is for those of you who are new to our call and to the space. So welcome. And then we're going to deal with something which is really, really critical and which we at MCLD have been talking and thinking about a lot. So all of us deal with a lot of violence, in the worlds around us, in our lives, in the societies we are in. And there is a lot of trauma that we experience, not just because of what's happening every day and from our work, but trauma that's historical, trauma that's part of the societies and has been ingrained in us. And the reality is, and I say this from personal experience, I think all of us are actually, guilty of this in some ways. But the reality is that in that moment, we are so busy doing what we have to do that we forget to deal with this trauma. We forget how important healing is for all of us to be able to really do the work that we are doing meaningfully and for our health individually as well as collectively. And that's why I am really, really excited about today's call, because this is a topic that we have been talking about a lot, or at least thinking about. I wouldn't say officially talking about, but thinking about a lot in the movement, given that so many of our colleagues work in areas like Northeast Nigeria, like DRC, Ethiopia, all of the areas where we deal with so much of uncertainty and trauma. But then also the rest of us who may not directly be living in these spaces and yet experience the trauma of dealing with this kind of violence, hardship, uncertainty, tragedy, frustration, sometimes just a loss of hope. Excuse me, that we, see on an everyday basis. So we have today with us colleagues from the Collective Change Lab. We're going to talk about how do we recognize and face these different kinds of trauma, and to provide us with a perspective of how healing can actually be transformative in our leadership and in making social change. That healing is not almost, the selfish thing that many of us sometimes think it is, but it is such a necessity for each one of us and for our collective work. So we're very, very thrilled to have them with us today, sharing a little more about the work that they have been doing. This is going to be an ongoing conversation within the movement in various forms: wellness, healing, taking care of ourselves and trauma. And then after that, we're going to go into a series of report outs. We've had some key things happening in the last couple of months, from the Majority World Letter that we've talked about to some other campaigns that are ongoing, and of course, conferences that we have attended and we would like to share back about. So that's going to be the second half of our call. So welcome, very excited to see, what we can come up with together. As always, encourage all of you to participate in the chat by raising your hands. This space is for all of us, and it is for our collective experience and collective strengthening of capacities and thinking together. With that, Sarah, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Gunjan.
Recording, Sarah, if you can mention that, I forgot.
Oh, we are recording this call as usual so that we can share it back with you all and anyone who wasn't able to attend. So if you don't want to be on camera in that recording, feel free to keep your camera off. As usual, we'll open with a short introduction to MCLD for anybody who's new to this space. The Movement for Community-Led Development is a dynamic, majority world-led network of networks dedicated to ensuring that every person has a fundamental right to voice in the decisions that affect their lives. We were launched in 2015 on the same day as the Sustainable Development Goals, when a group came together with their belief in the power and the potential of communities. We currently have over 2,000 local community-based organizations and 35 INGOs as members, and we're active in 17 countries through our national associations, which are in various stages. And those are the real heart and soul of our movement, and they're these really organic groups of local organizations and country offices of INGOs. And I see a lot of our National Association members here today. So hello, everyone. Really good to see you. At MCLD, we recognize the imperative to move beyond conventional development paradigms and embrace a really transformative model based on equitable partnerships and placing communities at the forefront of their own progress. And our ultimate goal is to bring community-led development to scale everywhere that it's needed. With that in mind, we have 5 goals: voice and agency for women, youth, and all marginalized groups, adequate community finance, good local governance, quality public services, and resilience. And the real work on these goals happens in our 17 national associations. We believe that the SDGs can only be achieved by facilitating a fundamental systems change that shifts power and resources to accountable, responsive, and effective local institutions. And this diagram outlines the theory of change process that begins with the formation of 2 types of partnerships for collective impact: advocacy and facilitation. We have advocacy partnerships that really try to mobilize public policy and policymakers around the need for devolving funding and decision-making to the local levels. And we have facilitation partnerships where we support communities, really community-based organizations, to be able to take action towards the goals that they set for themselves. And we believe that when these 2 things happen together, we'll be able to achieve the SDGs. And just briefly what we do, MCLD contributes to these goals through policy, global policy advocacy, mutual capacity strengthening, and forging partnerships with like-minded organizations and networks. Our thriving national associations, enhancing the practice of CLD, global solidarity, and collaborative research. I know that was really brief. And if you want to learn more, you can visit our website, mcld.org. But with that, we want to pass it over to our colleagues at the Collective Change Lab. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for welcoming us here today. And before we launch into our conversation, we would like to start by inviting everybody to take a moment to fully land here in our space. And so if you would like to join me, we'd like to take a moment for grounding ourselves, for centering. So I invite you to find a comfortable position for your body. And once you have that, if you'd like to close your eyes, that's all right. If you don't want to close your eyes, that's all right. Just press your gaze somewhere where your eyes can feel that they can rest, actually. And I invite you then to bring your attention to your breath and to savor the in-breath and feel what happens in your body as you take a deeper breath in. And then to allow yourself to feel the softening of your body as you breathe out. And do this at whatever rhythm feels right to you. Breathing in and enjoying the breath, and then breathing out and feeling yourself drop deeper inside of you. And let's do that twice more. So a deeper breath, as comfortable as it feels for you to go deeper, and then softening on the out breath and dropping deeper inside. And then with your next out breath, if you can bring your attention to whatever sensations are here in your body right now. And notice the sensations of life flowing through your body. Flowing sensations. Maybe you can feel your body supported. Maybe you can feel the air that touches your skin. Maybe you can feel your heartbeat. So I invite you to include whatever sensations are there. Also, if there's any discomfort, maybe some pain, to include that as well. And any places where you cannot feel yourself, to also include that. Places that might be numb. Any stress that you might have been walking with, just allowing it to be there and welcoming it here also. And then gently shifting your attention to your emotions and noticing what emotions might be here, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant, welcoming them all. And then noticing if they shift as you bring your attention to them, or if they stay the same. And whatever happens, we welcome that here as well. And then taking another deeper breath and then bringing your attention to your mind and observing your thoughts and noticing if they're moving very quickly or if they're moving more slowly. If your thoughts are new thoughts and there's a lot of creativity, or maybe it's the same thoughts and there's some stress in your mind, and just noticing that. Not trying to stop them, but just being in relation to them and noticing that. And then gently bring your attention now to the space between one thought and the next thought. Your inner space inside of which emotions, sensations, and thoughts occur. Just allow your attention to drop deeper into that inner space. And noticing what it feels like to just be in the space, allowing everything else to be there too. And then the last two things, if you can bring your attention to your feet, to the base of your spine, and connecting to Mother Earth. And see if you can drop a little deeper into the connection with her. And if that doesn't feel right, then allowing that also. And welcoming also the creatures that are around us and inviting our welcome to them also. And finally, to each other, if you connect with your heart and connect to what brought you here today. And then connect to that. There's many colleagues here who care and who are here because they care. And notice what it feels like to notice that. Taking one last deeper breath, bringing your attention back into this virtual room inside of which we are all sitting. And when you feel ready, gently open your eyes. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, John, to get us started, excuse me, with our conversation.
Thank you, Laura. That was beautiful, bringing us all together in this virtual space. Hello, everyone. My name is John Kania, and I'm the Executive Director of the Collective Change Lab. I'll say a little bit more about us in a second, but I first just wanted to thank the Secretariat of the MCLD for inviting us into this conversation with all of you about healing systems. And I also want to thank all of you who are listening in and who are involved in the work of collaborative community change, which is something I've dedicated my life to for the last dozen years plus. And I know firsthand how difficult and frustrating this work can be, but also how energetic and hopeful and just really full of joy, bringing communities together, bringing people together across sectors. It doesn't always, pop out that it works like that, but I'm hoping a number of you have seen just the power of collaborative community change. And thank you for holding both the light and the darkness of this work as you move forward towards transformation. A few words about Collective Change Lab. You heard from Laura, you'll hear a little bit more from her. Also on the line is Katherine Milligan, who is another one of our colleagues. And three of us will be sharing some perspectives on collective healing and systems change today. Collective Change Lab, we are a group of about 12 people at this point. We're working on 5 continents, North America, Latin America, Africa, Australia, and in Europe. And our work is really to help practitioners and philanthropists find deeper, more transformational ways of engaging in community change and systems change. And we work to sort of make a case for transformational practices, to help show what is possible, and also do experiment really on the ground in communities doing this work. So what we're going to be talking about today is really sort of, what we're finding out in thinking about healing and collective healing as literally a transformational practice in the work of community change, in the work of systems change. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got there, how we got to this as something we feel can really radically change and transform the way that we do social change work today. How did we get here? And then Katherine and Laura are going to speak about our work today. We really hope this will be a discussion. We're not coming with all the answers. We're trying to frame what we feel is a very important topic so that those that are actually doing the work can contribute to it and add to it as we go. Maybe, Sarah, we can go ahead and show the first slide. So how did we get here? Some of you may have seen this. I know MCLD has adopted this framework and is using it in your community change and systems change work. But for those of you who haven't seen it, we start with just a recognition of really what we think systems change is all about. And this was a framework we developed a number of years ago. And a couple of things to note. One is that when you think about systems change, you can look at it as happening in 6 conditions. The definition that we've adopted for what systems change is that systems change is about shifting the conditions that hold the problem in place. That was a definition that Social Innovation Generation in Canada came up with a number of years ago. So if systems change is about shifting the conditions that hold a problem in place, what are those conditions and what's their relationship to each other? So we identified 6 conditions happening at really 3 levels of transparency, visibility, explicitness, So you can see this top level of systems change is what we call the structural level. That's policies, practices, and resource flows. In my experience, particularly in the mainstream of the social sector, often when people talk about systems change, they are referring to policy or scaling practices or a combination of those two activities, but they're really missing what fundamentally will bring about long-term change in a system. So this top level structural change is, we call it the explicit level, that, you can in fact, you can see these things. They're sort of fairly obvious if you want to do the research and investigation into what's going on. Below that, one level deeper is what we call the relational change level. We said it's semi-explicit. You can kind of see it sometimes if you're in the middle. Sometimes you can't. And we talked about relationships and connections and power dynamics. A system that has poor connections between people is a dysfunctional system. So relationships and connections are very important. We want to try to align relationships around values if we're going to move the system. Power dynamics, obviously hugely important. I don't probably have to tell anybody on the phone that. One way to think about sort of, three dimensions of power dynamics are: number one, who gets to decide? Number two, who's setting the agenda? And number three, who's creating the narrative? Now, that third point of who's creating the narrative gets us to the deepest level of systems change, which is what we call mental models, which are sort of world views, values that people hold. The left has different values than the right, so to speak, in politics. So understanding the mental models that people are operating with. And often, one of the things I often share is that, at least in my perspective, when people are actually addressing systems change and wanting to shift a system, at least in the mainstream of the social sector, 90% of that activity tends to go towards structural change. There's a feeling if we change the structure of the system, the rest will follow. In fact, I think almost the converse, the opposite is true, that if you work on those second and third levels, which often we call the cultural change levels to compare it to the structural, if you work on the second and third levels, the cultural change, the relationships and connections, power dynamics, and mental models, you can in fact shift the system over the long term. Now, ultimately, we need to think about all 6 of these conditions, but our experience has been that you aren't going to get long-term sustainable systems change, community change, unless you fundamentally alter relationships and connections, power dynamics, and mental models. So our work as a group, Collective Change Lab, has really been focused on those second and third levels. And to shift that, we lean very heavily into what we call the relational work of systems change. And when we were trying to sort of ask ourselves, sort of, how do we get to shifting, the second and third levels, we developed a framework, which is on the next slide. And this came out of really asking ourselves how have people throughout history transformed and supported transformation in individuals and in groups. And we looked in places that were perhaps unlikely to think about social sector change. We looked at, truth and reconciliation work. We looked at restorative justice work. We looked at indigenous cultures and how they'd supported transformation. And we looked at Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. And we came up with a frame of 5 qualities that were important. First, starting at the bottom, is focusing on inner change as well as outer change. Beyond that, sort of working around deep relational change. So as you bring individuals and groups together, how do we sort of help support them in working in a much more generative and creative way together? The third is cultivating space for healing. The fourth is transforming power dynamics. And the fifth is welcoming in serendipity in the sacred. Now, we're going to talk today, really go deep on this issue, on this opportunity to cultivate space for healing. I think what we found as we've worked with this in a very practical way in communities and in collaborations is that you can think about these 5 different qualities as different entry points to the same thing, which is really about how do we get to deep relational change. I would say that, at least in my experience, the one that I think really cries out for us at this point in time in the history of the world to really go deep on, although it's connected to all the others, is this cultivating a space for healing. And that's what took us on a journey of sort of saying, how can we provide, useful perspective to social change practitioners and philanthropists in, how we think about this opportunity to, cultivate a space for healing. And I will shift it over now to Katherine.
Well, thank you so much. Bonjour, merci à tout le monde. We are really thrilled to be here speaking with all of you today. This is the piece of research, Healing Systems, that came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review just a couple of months ago. In a moment, Laura is going to talk through a few of our findings. We'll have space for reflection and conversation, and I'll also talk through some of our findings. I guess what I'd like to offer, just by way of kicking off this conversation, John, thank you so much for that introduction. Now as we shift gears and go deep into healing, right, is that we have a tendency, and I put myself in that bucket too, to really stay in the head with all of this stuff, right? To be very rational about it. And I just want to name that for us, for Laura, for John, for me, this was it wasn't just a head exercise. We really put a lot of our heart into it as well. So this ultimately is about connecting the head with the body and the heart. And that wasn't necessarily conveyed in the piece, right? Which does come across, I won't say academic, but, as a set of principles or learnings for leaders, etc. But we had endless conversations amongst ourselves as the co-authors about our own healing journeys, about our own experiences with trauma, and, sort of how are we connecting our lived experience with the findings and the interviews that we're doing with social change leaders and others, and vice versa. So these things really talk to each other throughout our writing and our research journey. So with that, I'd love to, as just a little bit of the context and the background, right? You don't see that when you see the piece, but we felt it was important to share that with you. With that, Laura, I'd love to invite you to reflect on, I think in one of the webinars that we did at the start of the year, you talked about how, your greatest teacher has been your own healing journey. So we've been learning from social change leaders, and, we've been connecting it to our own lived experience as well. So I'd love to invite you to just share a few reflections.
Sure. Thank you, Katherine. And I love that you start us off, going deeper here with that part of the connection between us and what we shared. Actually, one of the big messages that we have gotten is that we need to normalize the presence of trauma so that we find the permission to start addressing it in a deeper way. So part of what I feel is important for us to do is to actually, be that, So I'd like to share a little bit about who I am and why I do this. My name is Laura Calderon de la Barca Sanchez, and I am a Mexican mestiza, which means a person of mixed heritage. My lineages are both indigenous and European, and thanks to a genetic test I did, I found out that I also have African roots as well. So I am particularly delighted to be here with you today. And through my life here in Mexico, I experienced racial discrimination. And one of the things that I felt, yes, for sure, I needed to heal, but I realized, wait a minute, Mexico also needs to heal because we have not finished accepting our indigenous roots with honor and with respect. And until we do that, then the whole network that is Mexico has an issue with our identity. And so the first big piece of involvement I had with this topic was during my PhD research. So I decided I'm going to create a psychotherapeutic session for my country. And so I found a man in Australia who is a specialist in chaos and complexity theories. And I embarked on this amazing adventure that led me to the mountains of Oaxaca, to a group of indigenous communities with whom I did this, and to a group of Mexican and from other places of psychotherapists, groups of psychotherapists, and we did this work together there. And we found out together that there was a layer of shame that we were all carrying that we normally did not name. And actually, I did not know it was in me as well as in the space between us. Initially, I just thought that this horrible thing that I felt was called Laura instead of shame. Once I understood that, it was like, oh, thank God, that's not me. And, realizing that was a very important part of my healing process. And so, as Katherine was saying, that really has been my biggest teacher, even though I've also trained with some very amazing teachers. I spent some time with Robert Augustus Masters learning how to bring awareness and different techniques to work with the body, with emotions, with the mind, and to connect to spirituality for healing. And then I worked with Thomas Hubel, a spiritual teacher who has been working with collective trauma for a while. And so I studied with him, I worked with him, holding spaces for people from the global majority in his groups, and also doing exploration labs on the presence of the collective trauma of colonialism in Latin America, in Mexico, and in Colombia. And I also learned a lot from that. So, and now, I have this amazing opportunity of working with John, Katherine, and the rest of the team at the Collective Change Lab, where we have people from all over the world. We've got 2 colleagues in South Africa, another colleague in Australia, someone soon in New Zealand as well, beside me here in Mexico. So with that, I'd like to invite both John and Katherine to share a little bit about your own journeys before I jump into the information on trauma. So, John, I see you've got your mic open. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just a couple of things for me that are notable. I think I had some significant childhood trauma that, sort of remained below the surface until really as an adult, I started meditating and it came more to the surface. And for me, that's been sort of a lifelong, thing, just in terms of coming to terms with the responses that I have as a result of that trauma, and knowing when it's a trauma response and being able to manage that. The other thing I'll manage is, or mention is, as I've gone on my own sort of journey understanding this trauma and healing, is coming to some awareness that I often feel from an emotional standpoint, some numbness in terms of experiencing things. And I've come to learn that that's actually, sort of something that happens for white people and for often white men, and, relates to sort of intergenerational trauma that we went through and a certain numbing and that happens. And, for me at this particular point in my life, it's important for me to lean into that and to sort of try to continue to understand it, particularly as, a person of privilege.
Thank you, John. And Katherine?
Thank you both for those reflections. I will simply share that doing this work, this research, being in conversations with practitioners, social change leaders just like you, and going deep on myself has really been very healing. It's been very hard at times also, but it's been very healing. I too have experienced acute trauma, as have many of us. And I resonate, John, with some of the numbing, absencing responses. Push it down deep. Just don't look at it. Don't let it surface and keep going. And in my case, that lived experience of trauma is also connected to collective trauma and intergenerational trauma. So for me, the layers of trauma, both how our bodies and our psyches respond to trauma, and also what Laura will share with us in a moment about layers of trauma, I feel it and experience it in my bones. I know it to be true, and it resonates so deeply with so many practitioners that we're in conversation with. So it's an honor to be here in conversation with all of you today, and to exploring this more deeply.
Thank you, Katherine. So if we could show the slides, please. And in our exploration, we started with the individual dimension of trauma. And if we go to, thank you. So we started with the individual dimension of trauma and used it as a guiding metaphor to help us understand what happens at higher scales of manifestation, that is in organizations, movements, and systems. So we'll start with the individual trauma also. If we could go to the next slide, please. So first, the word trauma means wound in Greek, blessure. And individual trauma refers to an invisible wound caused by an overwhelming event, a series of events, or of enduring conditions. If we are in a dangerous situation, our autonomic nervous system, that's the one in charge of our survival functions like our heartbeat, our digestion, urination, etc., might respond with high levels of stimulation and movement, the famous fight or flight response. Or if the situation is truly life-threatening, our body shuts down, which is the freeze response. If we don't have the conditions to safely process the impact of the overwhelming experience on us, our autonomic nervous system fragments off the information and the leftover energy away from our conscious awareness, but it stays held unconsciously in our body and mind. This distorts our perception of danger and safety such that we will react to a trigger that happens later in a moment where the danger is not there, as though we were back in the life-threatening situation until we heal from the original trauma. Then intergenerational trauma occurs when one or more of our ancestors pass along unhealed trauma that they experienced before having children or during pregnancy. The information that was encoded in their bodies as sensations, emotions, and reactions gets transmitted to the next generation through epigenetic mechanisms. That is, the part of our genetic system that encodes information from our environment to give us a better chance of surviving, and also through family dynamics. Then collective trauma is the population-level impact of a catastrophic event or process that disrupts structures and systems that our society and community have created to sustain its way of life. A collective trauma event disrupts the flow of activities and or destroys or blocks access to resources that are normally available, like we saw with the COVID pandemic, where our systems for health, education, production, transportation, and social support were overwhelmed or disabled. Collective trauma can result in experiences of fragmentation, isolation, disorientation, dehumanization, and even death. Natural disasters and wars are classic examples of collective trauma. Then we have historical trauma that can be collective and intergenerational, but it refers specifically to intentional harm and oppression committed against a group of people because of characteristics such as skin color, religion, or national, social, or sexual identity, and they're aimed at subjugating people to obtain gain. Slavery and colonization are classic examples of historical trauma, and they are also collective in nature. And finally, systemic trauma, which includes the unaddressed impacts of individual, intergenerational, collective, and historical trauma that are active within a system because they're brought in by the people, the structures and relationships within the system, as well as the fresh trauma that is created by harmful present-day structures and relational dynamics within a system. Now let's take a look at some of the trauma responses that appear in the different scales of manifestation. So if we can look at the next scale, slide, please. First, we have the fight responses. Their objective is to gain control over the threat, and they include, among others, overreacting to minor infractions, shaming or misrepresenting mistakes as character flaws, excessively harsh criticism, micromanaging, among others. The flight responses are meant to distance ourselves from the threat, and so they include fragmentation, confusion, and disorganization, not acknowledging an overwhelming reality, downplaying consequences, among others. We also have the freeze response, which can happen when we cannot either fight or flee, and they include becoming paralyzed, withdrawing, numbness, insensitivity, among others. Now, how do we move out of this? If we could go to the next slide. Although the answers are complex, thinking of providing some ways that can be supportive and looking at it from the perspective of our autonomic nervous system, then we can find some answers. The same energy and impulse that we can have when we're perceiving danger can be turned into a different response when we reach safety and can re-engage that energy in a different way. So broadly speaking, we have three ways of both addressing challenges and resourcing ourselves or recharging ourselves when we are in spaces that feel safe. First, and that's in the top, through our social engagement system that, at the body level involves our voice, involves our face, involves that we use to connect with others. Then we have also the part of us that resolves through the sympathetic branch of our nervous system by mobilizing and using action to resolve, especially when we engage in joint and collective action. That can be very healing, and to resource ourselves also through movement and with joy. Finally, in the bottom part, through the parasympathetic branch of our nervous system, we solve things by entering stillness, giving our body space to restore ourselves, such as what we did at the beginning of the session. In practice, to regulate our nervous system, and if we could move to the next slide, please. To regulate our nervous system when we are in a safe and respectful environment with our social engagement system, the first one, we can talk to each other, we can laugh, we can play or express ourselves through writing or connect through reading. We can also connect to the divine through prayer and in talking circles in our organizations. Then the next layer, with our sympathetic nervous system, we can engage our body in sport, in dance, singing, gardening. We can also do chores or paint or draw or engage in martial arts, yoga, rituals, or in other activities where we move our bodies in coordination and with other people also. And then finally, with our parasympathetic nervous system, we can focus on our breath, we can meditate, we can contemplate nature, we can rest, or we can cuddle as these puppies to help us restore and reset our nervous system. However, there are also systemic dimensions, structural inequalities, and power imbalances that need to be addressed for the underlying issues that generate trauma to be truly addressed, and that we can only resolve collectively. Finally, I'd just like to share some of the messages that we have gathered from leaders who are engaging with healing to address trauma in systems that have mentioned that we need to start with ourselves, that leaders have a big role to play in helping normalize trauma, that our understanding of leadership needs to change to include vulnerability as a resource, and our organizations need to become trauma-informed and healing-oriented. And in this regard, we need to include in our understanding the toll that trauma takes on our bodies and mental, emotional, physical well-being, and the role that relationships and the body have in healing. So we would like to take a moment now, and if we could go to the next slide, please. And invite you to respond to the following question to create a word cloud together. And then I believe that we can get some support from the team. Is there a link for us to answer this in the
Yep, Sarah, can you put the
yes. So we have the question on the chat. And if you can, so if you could click on the link that was just provided there for you, there you have space to to respond. What practices recharge you in your life and in your work? So walking is one, and we'd love for everyone to put in your own so that we can create this together. Friends, talking.
You can also put responses into the chat box if that's easier for you.
Right, thank you. So silence, home, gathering, cooking, music, shopping, rock, movie, climbing, dog. Naps, very important too. Family. Hugs. So thank you, and you can keep them coming. And so if we would like to also hear if there's anything else that's coming up for you that you would like to share before we turn to Katherine to continue our exposition.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's beautiful to see this word cloud and to see what's nourishing and what's resourcing, what helps all of you recharge and the work that you're doing. I think maybe if it's okay, just in the interest of time, just a couple more slides. We probably won't get through them at all, get through all of them, but we would love to have time for conversation at the very end. So just a few thoughts before we open it up. The interesting thing about the trauma responses that Laura shared at an individual level, right, is that we can also see or recognize some of these responses at larger scales, right? Higher orders of manifestation in our organizations, in our partnerships, and in the movements that we're a part of, and even in the systems themselves that we're working to shift. Not exactly the same, but similar. And so that's the notion of a fractal. These are self-similar patterns that replicate at different scales. And that makes a lot of sense because our organizations and our movements and even, our healthcare system and our criminal justice system, these are simply made up of people, right? And the relationships between them. And it won't be a surprise to any of you to hear this, but just reflect for a moment on how it feels when you hear it articulated in this way, that the people working in these systems are bringing their own individual life experience with trauma. They're pinging against, and in some cases activating, other people's trauma. In the work that they're doing, they're experiencing vicarious trauma, okay, the trauma of the other people that they're serving and working with. And they're working in systems that are burdened and weighed down by unresolved and unhealed historical trauma and collective trauma. So I even feel the need to take a breath when I think about it that way. But it is insightful and helpful to use this metaphor of a fractal to extrapolate some of those responses at an individual level to larger scales of manifestation. And that's what's here on the next slide. And when we tested this, thank you, with the social change leaders that we interviewed throughout our research, not a single one of them said, oh, I've never experienced that before. This is unfamiliar to me, right? The opposite. The most common reaction has been, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. I don't feel so alone anymore. This helps me give words. This helps me name what I experience, what I come up against, that stuckedness in the system, the resistance, the blockages, the fragmentation, the denial. And the ability to name it and acknowledge this felt experience, like putting on a new pair of glasses, helps us see it for what it is, right? That these are collective and systemic trauma responses. And it also helps us interpret the relational dynamics in a system and the behavior in a system in new ways, right? It helps us to understand a source of that stuckedness and resistance. And that helps us discern or identify more effective ways of working in our organizations and in our movements and in our communities. And a key insight in how to do that, again, if we ground ourselves in the simple truth that systems are relational, is to tap into the healing power of relationships, right? Again, no one on the call needs me to tell you this. We heal most deeply through others and in community with others. So, and we do that in our personal lives and in our faith communities all the time. And what we're trying to explore is how can we do that in the work, right? How can we leverage the healing power of relationships to fundamentally rewire our system's behavior and the outcomes that it's producing? So how do we think about more healing-centered ways of working in our organizations, in our movements, and in the broader efforts that we're a part of? So if we go to the next slide, and I think we'll probably stop there. We have some examples, but in the interest of time, I think we'll maybe just share these and then open it up for what's coming up for people, and where's their energy for further discussion. There's no one size fits all to collective healing. Many of this will look extremely basic, even obvious to people on the call. Using rituals, connecting to nature, harnessing the power of bearing witness to people's stories, embodied practices, right? Getting back into the body. That's through singing, that's through chanting, that's through walking, that's through yoga, that's through whatever embodied practices feel most nourishing to you. Healing circles, and of course, honoring identities and languages. So, and many, many more. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is through the interviews that we conducted with change leaders working on multiple continents and in multiple systems, some of the commonalities that we saw across them. But this is a living list, a living document. We would love to add to it. We would love to continue to expand this through the experience and the wisdom of everyone on this call. The last thing I would just say is many of you may already be working in these ways and simply not necessarily framing it in that way or talking about it in that way, in your donor reports or in your dialogues. Because the thing that we're trying to point to is that these ways of working aren't necessarily prioritized among the funding community, right? Not in the mainstream anyway, that there are many funders, particularly, you know, Global North funders, that don't view this as don't view prioritizing healing as a good use of time and resources. And what we're trying to point to is the opposite, that unless we center these ways of working, we're not going to transform our systems, right? We're not going to get that transformative change that we seek. So how is it that we can also work to move these practices more into the mainstream and encourage not just collective efforts, such as the movements that you're all leading and running, but also the resource providers and those that are supporting and funding those efforts to acknowledge and to resource and to prioritize these ways of working as well. That's, as John said at the beginning, we don't have all the answers. We're not coming here with answers. We're coming here with a desire to share what we're learning so far, and to collectively search for answers together. So I think with that, we'll stop there, and we'd love to just hear what is surfacing for people in the room.
There are also a couple of comments in the chat box.
Yes, thank you, Nellie. You tell us how would the Secretariat like to field questions? We'd invite people to raise hands. If you don't have a good connection, you're welcome to put a comment in the chat, but we'd love to bring in some other voices as well. So we'd love to encourage anyone to just share a personal comment that's surfacing for you now.
So yes, feel free to raise your hands, type in chat. Again, Francophone colleagues, please feel free to ask, comment, share in French. We do have simultaneous interpretation going on, so
In the meantime, maybe I'll just read what Maya, oh, Raphael put his hand
Raphael.
up. Go ahead. Raphael, please unmute. Yes.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde. Est-ce que vous m'écoutez?
Oui.
Oui, nous t'écoutons.
Très bien, merci.
Oui,
Sinon, moi,
Raphaël,
je
on
suis...
te reçoit 5 sur 5.
D'accord, je suis Raphaël Ngouba, je travaille au compte de l'organisation Recherche sans frontières, RCF en sigle, depuis la RDC au Nord Kivu. On est basé à Goma, mais nous avons des activités sur le terrain au niveau du territoire de Massissi, Rutshuru et Walikale. C'est là où on essaie de mener les activités, mais aussi de l'autre côté, au niveau du site Kivu, dans le territoire de Kalehe, du côté Minova. Alors, par rapport aux expériences que nous avons dans le cas de guérison des traumatismes, nous avons quelque chose à apporter dans le cadre d'organiser les groupes thérapeutiques. Donc, ça veut dire que nous réunissons les bénéficiaires qui ont des signes ou présentant des signes de traumatisme et nous essayons aussi de prendre d'autres femmes, par exemple, au niveau communautaire des femmes sages. On les mélange avec celles-là qui ont des signes de traumatisme et voilà, avec les groupes thérapeutiques, facilement entre eux, ils peuvent mener des jeux récréatifs, donc ils essaient de jouer ensemble. Et ça aussi, ça permet que les ménages qui sont ou soit les femmes présentant les signes de traumatisme puissent avoir quand même cette étape-là de jouer avec les autres femmes au niveau de la communauté, et ça permet directement à leur intégration au niveau communautaire, mais aussi voir comment ils peuvent essayer aussi de s'adapter facilement au sein de la vie quotidienne dans le cadre de relèvement social au niveau des communautés. C'est un peu ça ce que je voulais partager avec ce que nous faisons au niveau du terrain. Mais à part ça aussi, il y a parfois qu'ils sont orientés dans les maisons d'écoute pour que aussi les agents psychosociaux puissent aussi essayer de faire une écoute active dans ce sens-là et donner aussi d'autres orientations dans le cadre d'appui en conseil. C'est un peu ça ce que nous faisons de notre côté. Peut-être s'il y a d'autres questions qui nous concernent, on peut toutefois y répondre. Merci.
Thank you very much, Raphael. And it's lovely to hear, about the power of play being put to use in making these women feel included and helping their nervous system settle. As if you're playing, you have to be safe. You cannot be playing in the middle of something very dangerous going on. So that sends a signal to the body. And it's so beautiful to hear that that's one way that you're using that. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Bonjour à tout le monde.
Bonjour, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je suis Jean-Marie Rouana Mirindi de la FOPAC Sud Kivu, en République démocratique du Congo. Je voudrais aussi profiter de l'occasion de dire que d'abord merci aux présentateurs parce que ce sont des thématiques vraiment qui cadrent avec la vie que nous menons en République démocratique du Congo, parce que les nombres de personnes traumatisées ou alors même de groupes traumatisés augmentent du jour le jour au vu de la situation sécuritaire qui prévoit à l'est de la République démocratique du Congo. Et comme vous le connaissez, plus de 2 décennies, qu'il y a tuerie, il y a viol, il y a plusieurs exactions qui font à ce que actuellement plusieurs communautés vivent la peur au ventre. Tel que l'a dit mon prédécesseur, on essaie quand même de faire des orientations et surtout sur ce que nous pouvons dire de temps en temps, il y a des orientations qui sont guidées, mais il y a aussi des référencements peut-être guidés dans le sens d'atteindre, par exemple, les centres psychothérapeutiques, faire des rencontres avec des psychosociales, mais également on retrouve que il fallait aussi même une justice, parce qu'autant plus que la personne vit avec les bourreaux. Toutefois, ces traumatismes rentrent toujours. Et c'est là que nous avons dit qu'avec cette thématique, peut-être on peut développer d'autres mécanismes qui pouvaient accentuer aussi la résilience des personnes et des communautés. Mais également aussi, on rencontre aussi qu'il y a des traumatismes même entre les organisations. Parce que il y a des organisations peut-être qui cherchent des positionnements, qui s'orientent dans telle ou telle thématique. Et cela fait que, normalement, on a un système de plus haut, de plus bas, et cela présente aussi des traumatismes. Et c'est là que nous souhaitons avoir au moins d'autres pistes qui pouvaient nous aider, à part l'assistance médicale, à part l'assistance économique. Peut-être avec nos experts, il y a d'autres mécanismes qui peuvent être proposés afin que cela puisse se réduire au niveau de notre République. Merci beaucoup.
If H.
Bonjour, oui, c'est mon tour. Je peux parler?
Yep.
Yes, we
Oui,
do.
donc, voilà, je me présente, c'est Aïta Bahayet de l'association Jazairuna des familles victimes de terrorisme, Algérie. Donc, moi, je vais répondre un peu dans le même sens que mon camarade, puisque Jazairuna a un centre d'écoute pour les personnes victimes de violences. Nous travaillons beaucoup avec les femmes et les enfants victimes de violences. Donc, nous avons deux catégories de victimes. Donc, nous avons les victimes des années 90, car l'Algérie quand même a connu une période de violence extrême. Donc, nous avons des victimes de terrorisme que nous recevons au sein de l'association. Nous avons les femmes et enfants victimes de toute forme de violence, d'autres formes de violence, violence sexuelle, conjugale, basée sur le genre et tout. Donc, même si nous avons développé pas mal de mécanismes justement pour gérer les traumatismes, puisque nous avons une équipe pluridisciplinaire composée d'assistants sociaux, de psychologues, de juristes et d'écoutantes, mais moi j'ai remarqué que pour les victimes de terrorisme, par exemple, il y a le traumatisme, nous n'avons pas quand même pu atténuer ce traumatisme, même si nous avons développé d'autres pistes telles que le théâtre, les ateliers d'écriture, la peinture, les groupes de parole et tout. Et c'est des mécanismes un peu que nous développons aussi avec les autres victimes d'autres formes de violence. Moi, ma question, ça serait dans le même sens que mon camarade. Est-ce que on peut identifier ensemble d'autres pistes justement pour atténuer ce traumatisme, notamment pour les victimes de terrorisme? Parce qu'ils ont vécu des violences extraordinaires. C'est pas des violences, même si je n'aime pas utiliser ce terme de violence ordinaire, extraordinaire, mais quand même, ils étaient face à des violences extrêmes, des violences extraordinaires. Donc, est-ce que nous pouvons identifier ensemble des pistes et est-ce que vous pouvez justement épauler nos psychologues dans ce sens? Merci beaucoup.
I'd be happy to offer some comments on that. Part of what makes healing from something like terrorism so challenging is because there's also an aspect of it that has to do with the environment. And so because trauma lives in our bodies need to be able to do something about it. And so the way that I work with this that has provided some relief, and you might try this, is by using something that is symbolic and that is concrete. So, for example, I would have a cushion or something, and that's where I would place terrorism or the terrorists or that which we have no control over. And then using that symbol, allow the body to discharge the trauma reactions. So throwing it away or pounding on it or, kicking, just allowing the body to have the experience that it's actually able to do something. That releases some of that charge that otherwise has nowhere to go. Because trauma reactions are meant to be helping us survive. And the body needs to feel that it's actually doing its job so that it can rest. That is the kind of intervention that I have used with people. And although, it cannot take care of everything because there's also the conditions that are present that don't get changed by that. But in terms of the situation in the body of the person, that can provide some relief.
Thank you, Laura. And many thanks to the team from CCL. Also, thank you for everybody who shared. It's not easy talking about trauma, whether it's individual, collective, intergenerational, historical. These are very difficult topics to talk about. So thank you for sharing. And I hope we are able to keep this conversation going because there is a need for healing within all of us and within our societies. And really that societal healing starts with each one of us. recognizing our traumas, the different kinds of traumas, and moving from there. So thank you so much, Laura, Katherine, and John, for sharing your work with us, for sharing some of the ways in which you have also experienced traumas and the different kinds of trauma, because I think we very often very limit our idea of what trauma is and tend to almost minimize our own trauma as less important than what we think it should be. So thank you so much for that and for, coming and sharing this. I also really want to thank our colleagues, Pascal, who has been working, I believe, for a while with the team from CCL, and Sarah and Nelly for, for bringing this beautiful session to us with Laura, Katherine, and John. I don't know if there are any resources or links that you would like to share in the chat for people who want to delve more into this. But given that we only have 15 minutes left on our call, we will now move on to the next segment of it. And again, if you have questions, observations, this is a lot to take in. It's a lot to process. It doesn't come in immediately. Sorry. So as things come up for you, I know we are trying to create within MCLD spaces where we can be more supportive of each other and create spaces for well-being. So thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you for having us. We would be happy to share links and resources with all of you. These are big, important topics that have been raised. Thank you very much for letting us be in the space with you.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and I don't know if my explanation was clear enough, but if not, I'll leave my my email here so that you can check in with me if you need more clarification on what I'm suggesting here. And thanks everyone for sharing and for being here for this important conversation.
Take care.
And thank Sarah, I think you can put the slides back up for Gunjan.
Thank you so much. And so we have a few things that we would like to share next. One or two updates on two important campaigns that have been doing the round that we did want to share with you. We also wanted to share a little bit of a share out from the Women Lift Health Conference. Actually, I'm going to invite my colleague Joanna to maybe share that first. Joanna?
Joanna, are you? Oh, here we go. Great.
Yes. Sorry, Nelly, what is it you're saying?
No, just go ahead.
Oh, yeah, okay. It's kind of hard after the session we just had. It was really called for a lot of retrospection and the healing and the thinking. So it takes me back to something else, to my life and my history and what it should be like and what it can be like. Anyway, back to where we are. On the 6th to the 8th, MCLD was privileged. We had an opportunity. We attended the Women Lift Health Global Conference in Dar es Salaam. And myself and my colleague Gunjan, we attended. It was a good conference, I must say. It was a good platform for the civil society organizations coming together to share knowledge and their experiences, to network, to figure out how to create change in terms of health, global health, and the outcomes. I wanted to share about the conference, my observations at the conference. From my own perspective, as somebody coming in from the majority world, the arrangements were done for us. All we have to do was to fly there. So what I offered in there was my time, my knowledge, and my presence in reality. Everything else was arranged for us. The residence where we stayed at the Hyatt Regency, which was really, really close to the venue. I forget the venue. No problem anyway. But it was about an 8 minutes walk, which was really convenient for us, and even all the other participants, they were booked within a range. I'm looking at those areas that were really good practices for us as majority world participants, always going into international and global conferences to attend and participate. The sessions were really beautiful. They were informative, they were interactive, and we had a couple of trainings there, learnings. We had about leadership, we had about storytelling, we had about health management. There were a couple of them you had to choose whichever you wanted to attend. There was a selection, you choose whichever you find interesting. Being a good leader and all that much, you had to choose what interests you. That is where you have to go. The other thing I really noticed is that the biggest number of participants were women. Over 95%, I would guess, were women, which was kind of, I don't know, from my perspective, is that if we need to make the change, if we need to drive change, everybody has to be involved. I know it was a women's global conference, yes, but the men were not really there. So if there's anything we have to discuss there, it's like we just have to report it back to them without them being involved. So really, it was good. I cannot say how much or how many local CSOs were involved. I can't really give any idea, or I have no idea or comment on that. But what I know is that MCLD, that represents local organizations, was in the presence thing, and we had a platform to speak. We were given the platform to talk. And anyway, the other issue that was really, really good practice is that everybody had access to information. We had an app. We were given the opportunity to download the app on our phones. I still actually have it. And there you would get all the information you want about the conference. Although the planning, we were not really involved. Maybe we didn't have to. It was anyway an interesting and relevant arrangement for us to participate in. So that is what I really noticed about the conference. Otherwise, we had a lot to learn. We had a lot to share. It was really, really good. The branding was high up there. It was 100% a beautiful thing. And we were all proud to associate with it because I see a lot of things happening in social media, on LinkedIn, on WhatsApp. Many people are talking about it. It was really, really good. It was really good. And I really appreciate that my colleague, actually, Gunjan, does quite a lot of work, was the one behind our participation, which is a great piece of work there because we raised the profile for MCLD. And I hope and pray that we get many other opportunities out there to talk about community-led development, to show and share the relevancy of this practice. I thank you very much. Back to you, Nelly.
Thank you, Joanna. Much appreciated. And it was very interesting. You know, we're talking about trauma here, today's session, as Joanna said. And first, thank you, Laura. I see that you're answering the question some of our participants had in the chat. I appreciate that. You know, we've been talking a lot about the trauma that a lot of majority world participants experience when they actually go to these international spaces. It's a different kind of trauma, but it is trauma, and it is overwhelming, and it is chaotic, it is frustrating, it's there are lots of these emotions. And as many of you know, that resulted in the campaign for the Majority World Letter last November that we had sent out to funders and to international organizations and conveners. And then on, this is the first letter that you see on the slide, the sign-on letter for local and community-based organizations. We were over 1,900 signatures when we announced an update this April, because we had promised everybody an update on what's going to happen next. The letters are still open. We've had a lot of INGOs, convening networks, and funders coming in and committing. And that's a huge thing, because this was the first time that majority world activists and actors were sharing their trauma, their pain. But not just that, they were also sharing with funders steps that they can use to address this trauma, this pain, to make these spaces inclusive, to make people like us feel accepted, to feel respected, to feel that we can meaningfully participate. And that's kind of what Joanna was alluding to, that some conferences are beginning to do that. Some conferences are beginning to understand how important it is to ensure that people who come in, especially people who come into these spaces for the first time, are able to meaningfully do that. Do not feel suppressed, do not feel, a whole plethora of emotions that you feel when you go to an event for the first time. Sarah has shared in the chat box a link to the Majority World Letter and developments on that. If you are an INGO or a convening network, you can sign on to the commitment statement. If you are a Majority World organization, you can sign on to the letter demanding these principles if you agree with them. We have over the last few months been working with Peace Direct and Civicus, the 3 groups that were facilitating this, to create a guidance document, and very shortly we expect to share it with all participants who were part of the listening cafes and different platforms that were created to be able to come together to create this guidance document. And we hope that this guidance document will provide conveners and funders and others who organize spaces for dialogue and convenings to design them in a manner that they are inclusive, particularly for majority world nationals. The other letter that you see on the screen is something I wanted to bring up. Recently, the government in Sweden announced that they are going to cut funding to Swedish organizations. Now, in Europe, in a lot of countries, the policy is that the aid funding that the bilateral agencies provided went to local organizations, so CSOs from that country, and they were then funneled out to local organizations. Now, there are obviously a lot of challenges and problems with that, because that meant that local organizations were starved for funds. They did not get direct funding. And that is the opposite of what locally led development, or CLD, is about, right? We talk about direct funding to local organizations. So the fact that they decided to cut this and to make this funding available directly to local organizations was great. But at the same time, we know that this is a government which is trying to restrict civil space. And a lot of governments in many countries, right-wing governments, are coming up to actually weaken civil society. So a letter campaign was launched with 3 majority world networks, MCLD, NEO, VAXC, 2 global networks, Ringo and the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and an INGO Peace Direct. And we sent a letter to the Swedish Development Agency saying that the idea of locally led development and embracing and directly funding local organizations is very, very welcome and much needed, but they need to do it properly. They need to ensure that the funding is designed for local organization, covers their operational costs, is multi-year, is flexible. And it also raises the challenges of just suddenly, on a whim, discontinuing funding to existing organizations, even if they are INGOs, because they work with local partners, and it does weaken civil society. So these are the 2 letters that have gone out, and 2 campaigns which we've been running and a part of. One we are a part of, one that we have been facilitating from MCLD, and we wanted to make sure that all of you are aware of this. If you have any questions, concerns, about these, please feel free to reach out to us. And with that, Nelly, over to you.
Thank you, Gunjan. And yes, thank you again to the Collective Change Lab and to all of you, and for the continued really rich conversation that's happening in the chat box. I think one thing that we want to explore with you all is whether it would be good to have more opportunities to discuss and work with Laura and Katherine and John on this and bring others into that conversation. And we can think about the different opportunities to do that. But I would love to hear from you all if you would like more time on these topics, which I think from the conversations you would. I also wanted to flag a few other upcoming calls and collaborative learning opportunities that we have. Next week is the next Unlearning Lab on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We've been holding this series of calls for a little while now. This will be our, I believe, our 5th or 6th in the series. And it will focus on collecting data in a community-led way to understand the learning questions and the indicators that have been set. This will be hosted by our colleagues from Outreach International in the Philippines, so it will be an hour earlier than usual. And Sarah, maybe you could put the registration link in the chat box if people want to register for it now, but there's also emails and calendar invitation for that. And you can watch the previous 4 or 5 videos on our website, and we'll put the link to that also in the chat. The next leadership call, monthly leadership call, will be on May 15th. An invitation has not yet gone out for that, but we will send it out. The next monthly call is May 29th, 4 weeks from now. And I also wanted to flag that the working groups are launching. There is one already underway on US government and Hill advocacy, and that's more targeted towards US-based members. We are also launching with the first meeting on Monday, a working group on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And soon we'll be also launching one on global advocacy and communications. And if you are interested in joining any of these, you can email me. I'll put my information in the chat box. Here's the link to the working groups. And with that, thank you all again so much for joining today, and we look forward to continuing to unpack these heavy issues that we know affect all of us. And with that, I think we can go off mute and on video if you can, and say goodbye and until next time. Bye,
Thanks so
everyone.
much.
Bye. And one last thing, I know
Oh,
a lot.
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, a lot
Okay,
of
bye.
people
Next
were
time.
talking about resources. We
Yeah,
will
good time to
consolidate and email the resources to everyone on
Yes.
chalk healing. Dr. Laura has been sharing some fabulous resources.
Bye-bye.
So thanks and bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. It was beautiful being here today with you all. Au revoir.
Okay, bye.
It's nice to be with you.
Ok, merci beaucoup.
Yeah.
Au revoir.
Yeah.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, merci et bonne suite à
Merci.
vous.
Merci.
Bye, bye. À la prochaine.
Au revoir.
Okay. Waiting for you.
Bye all. Thank you.